Welcome to SSR's April seminar titled Cultural Competence and Diversity in Casework and Counselling. In a while, you'll be hearing from speaker Associate Professor Timothy Sim, who is the Head of Program Master of Counselling at the Singapore University of Social Sciences. This event will be moderated by Dr Chua Wei, who is Executive Director at Counselling and Care Centre. Before we begin, I have a few announcements to make. The first is that this webinar is streamed live currently on our Facebook page, and the recording will be available there after the event. The content from our seminar recordings will be used for publicity purposes in the future. By participating in this webinar, you acknowledge and consent to the above. Secondly, the speaker has agreed to share the slides with participants of this seminar. So at the end of, in the coming days after the seminar ends, there will be a post-seminar email in which the webinar recordings and presentation slides will be shared. So please look out for that. For the Q&A section later, there are two ways in which you can ask questions. First is through the Poll Everywhere link, in which you can post your questions to the speaker. You may use the QR code that you see on your screen right now to access the Poll EV link. Alternatively, you may also unmute and voice your questions directly to the speaker. Please use the raise hand button that is available on your Zoom taskbar and wait for the moderator to call your name. Please note that we will not be taking any questions from the Zoom chat and Facebook comments. Here is an upcoming seminar that we'll be organizing in less than 2 weeks' time on the 9th of May. This seminar is by the team from Care Corner Singapore on the perceptions of youth in public spaces. You may find out more information at the QR code that you see on your screen right now and sign up for the seminar there. Without further ado, I'll be passing over the time to Associate Professor Timothy Sim, who will begin his presentation. Prof. Sim, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Let me begin by sharing my slides with you. So I would like to thank NUS Social Service Research Centre for inviting me to this webinar this afternoon. And I would like to thank Dr. Chua Wei for moderating the session. I look forward to having a good time learning and with you on cultural competence and diversity in casework, social work, and counselling. This is my QR code if you are interested to find out more about the work that I've been doing in the past 1-2 decades. You can visit it, and in it you can also visit the Scopus, which provides for you my recent publications. So what we're going to do today is there are 3 big chunks. The first chunk really is to be able to understand what is diversity and cultural competence in the context of counselling and social work. And then we'll look at the local development of cultural competence in social services in Singapore, and then where we can go from here in growing cultural competence in counselling and social work in Singapore. These are some of the topics that we will be covering today. I would bring you through step by step. Let's begin by looking at the term diversity. Now, diversity is an evolving concept that is rarely defined in the area of research. One of the most fundamental level is to look at diversity as difference. Diversity refers to all of the ways in which people are different from one another and differ in their practices, their life, and who they are. Diversity is a characteristic of groups, not of individuals. Now, to look at diversity further, we can actually think about diversity according to Williams in his very important book in 2013 about 2 aspects of diversity. One is the primary characteristics that refers to age, race, gender, ethnicity, mental and physical abilities, sexual orientation included. Then if you were to juxtapose it, then you can also look at the secondary characteristics. Then you can also focus on nationality, education, income, religion, work experience, language skills, geographical location, etc., etc. This reminds me of my discussion with colleagues from SINDA. When I asked them about what are the types of Indian families that are in Singapore, they actually told me there are 14 dimensions that include, for example, ethnicity of the Indian community in terms of their religion, their geographical, northern or southern India, which they originated from. And there are so many dimensions. Can you imagine just Indians, our Indian ethnic groups in Singapore, having 14 different dimensions? And if you crisscross the different dimensions, the diversity of our Indian community is really, really large. So we would do injustice in understanding our Indian colleagues or our Indian counterparts in Singapore by just grouping them as Indians. Now, our focus today, since diversity encompasses so many areas, we would just focus on the cultural diversity with a focus on cultural competence in counseling and social work. Now, perhaps we should start by asking, what is cultural competence? Let us have an overview of cultural competence, particularly using Cross and colleagues framework, which is based in psychology and in counseling. Cross and colleagues basically provided one of the most universally accepted definitions. Cultural competence is a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, in an agency, or among individual professionals and enable the system, agency, or individuals to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. This is a classic, and I highly recommend that you look up this article and the relevant literature to find out more about what cultural competence is in counseling as well as in social work. Now, cultural competence, according to the Cross framework, has a continuum, and there are different stages to it. Now, I'm going to look at the 6 stages. As I go through the 6 stages, may I invite you to think about which stage you are at, or your agency or your organization is at. The first stage, right? Let's have an, let's press the wrong thing, yes. Now, the first stage is cultural destructiveness, meaning then the second stage is cultural incapacity. The third is blindness. The fourth is pre-competence. And the sixth is cultural competence. And finally, cultural proficiency. So as it goes on, the higher the stage, the more competent you are culturally. Let's run through what these 7 stages are about. Where cultural destructiveness is about, it involves overt discrimination of certain people based on their differences, such as age, gender, ability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, race, and political affiliation. 2022 October, together with 2 colleagues, we went to London. That was at Charing Cross. And when we got out of the hotel, there was a white woman in her 40s, maybe 50s, walked past us and shouted, "Bloody Chinese." 3 of us were Chinese. I got shocked, right? And that's actually the place when I started realizing about racism. When I was doing my master's in family therapy, where I see clients who also did not want to see me because he thinks I'm a Chinese and not capable. And we had to deal with it. So that's cultural destructiveness as an example. Cultural incapacity and incompetence reflect overt form of discrimination. And then cultural blindness, when professionals assume that they are unbiased, but believe that dominant ideologies and ways of living are the same. Are you at any of this stage, or are you culturally pre-competent? signifies movement along the continuum when professionals might make attempt, right, to serve minority groups but lack relevant knowledge about various possibilities and procedures. I have this cup of tea here, and this is it's Teo Kosong Pinat. And that's what I learned yesterday from my Malay colleagues from Sana when we had our supervision. I was having diarrhea, and they said, "Why don't you drink Teo Kosong Kau?" And I said, "What?" That's really an antithesis to me, simply because I felt that tea and coffee are diuretic. So if I have diarrhea, I would never take tea or coffee. But my colleagues, my Muslim colleagues told me, no, 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 in the Malay community, that's what we do. And I thought that was an interesting knowledge that I never had. So I'm trying out since yesterday and has helped. So that's something about my competence in terms of the cultural remedies for even diarrhea. Then the next stage is cultural competence. In that sense, it's characterized by acceptance and respect for differences, self-assessment of professionals, consideration of dynamics of differences, expansion of cultural knowledge and resources, and a variety of adaptations to helping models. So when one is becoming culturally competent, we are a lot more respectful and open to differences, and that we embrace that we do not necessarily know. I would like to share with you and get my colleague from SSR to show you this very interesting video for just maybe about 30 seconds. Over to you. And when you are watching, look at how culturally competent they are. In what ways they are culturally competent. Thank you. Now, this is an Indian folk song that many of us may be familiar with because it's part of our national sing-along songs. I'm very impressed by Dr. Samuel Wong, together with his colleague from the Indian community, and put together this ensemble, including Western music, where they were able to share a folk song that is familiar to us. And I think that's a really good attempt to be able to work together to create music and to be able to enrich one another's culture. So let's look at the next level where we can be seen as culturally proficient. In that, professionals add to their knowledge base through research and experimentation and establish positive helping relationship with their clients and enable them to help themselves. I will share with you a clip that I have worked on in a later stage of today. That's hopefully a way of working proficiently with minority groups, but in the context of China after a horrific earthquake. Okay. All right. Let's have an overview of cultural competence development in social work internationally. Now, there are 10 models available in social work literature, from what I know. And based on these 10 models, if we further analyze it, you actually will get three major perspectives, according to Anderson and Carter, since 2003. And these three major perspectives include the ethno-cultural, which sensitize social workers to the relationship between ethnicity and culture when helping others as professionals. Number two, it is environmentally driven, by looking at ecological and systems interaction. For those who are familiar with the intersectionality, I think that's also a way of looking at policies and social movements, etc. And the third perspective in social work, it's that vulnerable life situations are to be taken into consideration, how practitioners can learn from clients about the impact of different vulnerabilities and strengths. So they have encompassed more than just culture, and to be culturally competent, they take into consideration larger contexts. Now, at the heart of all these diversity, cultural competence perspective are the strengths and empowerment frameworks. Now, there are four basic assumptions that can be derived from the synthesis of all of these frameworks. They are: number one, reality is socially constructed, whatever culture means, whatever power is. And number two, another basic assumption is to do with the diverse worldviews of different ethnicity, different culture, and we need to be able to appreciate all of these differences. Number three is that there are multiple realities that affect individual personalities. Number four, diversity education in social work and counseling, it's core. Now, if you have not already realized, these four basic assumptions is based on a postmodern where there is no absolute reality. And whilst this is useful, I would also like to remind you that from a positivistic point, that there is reality as far as, for example, bias or racism is concerned. People suffer. So that is not socially constructed. People literally suffer. So whilst we embrace a postmodern frame such as this, we need to identify and recognize there could be racial and biases at work, even for the social workers and counselors. Now, for us to be able to increase our cultural competence for social workers, first, social workers need to be educated to become self-aware. Self-awareness is key, and have an appreciation of their own value systems. And one of the first thing to look out for and confront is racism within ourselves before we look outside. So it's really a self-check. And at a second level, we need to be immersed in cultural experiences where we observe the uniqueness of every individual, respect and embrace them where possible. I've always grown up in a mainstream made up of Chinese in Singapore. It was until when I was in London in 1996, 97 that I became a minority. I was spat on. My clients didn't want to see me because I'm Chinese, and there were racism as I walked on the street in London, Camberwell area. So it became a realization that I had when I was overseas, no longer a mainstream ethnic group, that I realized it is not easy being a minority in a context. Now, as we have talked about the different cultural competence framework, I would like to make a critique on it. The literature in social work on cultural content is rather diffuse, and there is little consensus about which framework to use. And several models have been adapted to integrate the human diversity content into social work curriculum. However, there isn't enough that we, as far as the process stages that we have shared, used in counseling, that is incorporated. This critique comes from myself, where I think that it is not detailed enough, where sometimes it gets a bit too conceptual. We are not able to articulate the stages that agencies and individuals could be at. Now, the social work syllabi, particularly based in the USA, was simply accommodated to enable white students who are in the mainstream to receive some basic understanding about various cultural and diversity issues since the 90s. So that's something that we need to be very worried about when we go about adopting some of these cultural competence frameworks. Now, the next is there is too much focus at times on individual professionals and not enough emphasis on how an organization at policy or practice processes that would take into consideration some of the needs of cultures. For example, I know of an agency where Malay social workers have been instructed, knowing that the families have dogs in these families, and the Malay workers come back and said, no, I'm not able, I don't feel comfortable, but was not given a choice. So these are the kind of organizational practices and policies that should be in place. Now, how about locally? How have we been developing cultural competence in social work and counseling? Now, little can be found on cultural competence development in Singapore social work field. My colleague, Dr. Rosalind Al, and her colleagues developed a book called Cross-Cultural Social Work, Local and Global, sometime in 2013. This is a wonderful book that collects works from contributors with different practice settings and from different countries, which facilitates the development of cultural competence among social work students, educators, practitioners, and researchers. Highly recommend this book. Now, in terms of counseling, there is probably a little more than social work, simply because of the work developed and the framework, classical framework developed by Cross. For example, Early and Ung in 2023, more than 2 decades ago, developed a conceptual framework called Cultural Intelligence, CQ, which examine an individual's aptitude to effectively interact with people from different cultural backgrounds. This is the 4 dimension on strategy, knowledge, motivation, and behavior. I'm not going to elaborate here in view of time, but strongly encourage you to look for the article and book and read them. Now, one of my esteemed colleagues, Len Jennings, in 2012, conducted a qualitative investigation on the multicultural competencies of 6 Singaporean master therapists, including Anthony Yeo himself, the late Anthony Yeo himself. And 8 themes within 2 categories emerged for those who are culturally competent. They have the multicultural knowledge, as well as they have the multicultural skills. In terms of knowledge, there is self-knowledge, self-awareness, cultural immersion. There is cultural knowledge about a particular group, and there is knowledge of systemic and historical oppression. In terms of the cultural skills, these masters therapists in Singapore are respectful. They know that cultural misunderstanding will lead them to becoming humble, and they will grow from these boo-boos that they may do in counseling. They ask, they don't assume, particularly when they meet a client that is of a different race. They suspend judgment and avoid imposing values. But interestingly, in Len's articulation of cultural competence, we realize that the term, the idea of cultural competence was not exactly the focus of this piece of work. Now, let's go on the 3rd dimension. How can we, and the last dimension of today's presentation, how can we grow cultural competence in Singapore? I will be borrowing some ideas internationally and giving my take on it. I have 4 suggestions. Number 1, let's look at what is available in terms of cultural knowledge for us by reviewing cultural competence literature in specific domains. 2, assessing individual and organizational cultural competence. 3, developing a local model on cultural competence. 4, boundary crossing training and leadership development. Let me elaborate very briefly. Number 1, reviewing literature on cultural competence in specific domains. What do I mean? Let me give you an example. What do we need to know in working with Muslim couples? When I have to start thinking about coming up with helping myself to help my counterparts in their marriages in the Malay community, when I was meeting with them through multi-family therapy after family violence, I realized that I don't know enough. So I started searching for what's available in working with Muslim couples, Malay couples. I found very little internationally. there's only a handful of only 20 articles, and that's not enough. That's a huge area of work for us in Singapore, and I think there is great potential for us to contribute to the international literature. Okay. When we are reviewing cultural competence and looking at the literature, we could include different types of materials. That's what we call black literature and gray literature. Black meaning those that are published in referred journals, refereed journals. Gray literature could be a book, could be a report, could be a movie. Now, we should also embrace both quantitative as well as qualitative local and overseas sources. Now, there are basically, when we are going into literature review on cultural competence, there could be so many possibilities, and that there are actually 48 review methods, and there are 7 review families, and these reviews can have different methods. If you are interested, you join us for a workshop which I will introduce to you. And when you're able to review these literature in a systematic, rigorous way, you can actually produce high quality and rigorous literature review that could be a study on its own and publish it very, very well based on my personal experience. And here, this is the workshop that we will be having in a few days' time. Do join us by producing a mega map of evidence. It's an introduction workshop to integrative review. Please join us if you are interested at SUSS via a webinar. Now, the second suggestion I have really is assessing individual as well as organizational cultural competence. Using, for example, the 6 stages of cultural competence, we could use the core competence of social work comprising of values, awareness, knowledge, and skills. That's what core competence is in social work, that comprises knowledge, values, and skills. Now, for example, these are the different dimensions in assessing professional competence. And you can see that these are the various tools that actually incorporated both competency and cultural competence. The core competence skills comprising knowledge, values, and skills. And there are all these inventories for you to make an assessment of yourself, as well as tweak them a little bit to evaluate your organization as well. Now, I would like to look at how organizational cultural competence is about. It is a dynamic, ongoing process that begins with awareness and commitment and evolves into cultural responsive organizational policies, processes, and procedures. It is important for us to look at how we can commit to improving cultural competence as an organization, but we must also remember to put into resources in order to develop it systematically. Now, so there is this wonderful model that our colleagues from USA have developed. So it started with processes like even in recruiting, hiring, and then how you embrace a diverse staff membership and use of interpreters for the services, casework that you do, counseling that you rolled out, and there is staff training, and there is fostering community involvement, facilitation of design and operation of services and programs, and developing culturally appropriate programs, say, for example, marital and couple and family therapy that would be relevant, culturally relevant program materials, incorporating culturally relevant treatment approaches, and developing and implementing of supporting policies and procedures, including reassessment processes, as well as disciplinary actions, for example. Now, the last suggestion I have really is pursuing a multi-dimensional cultural competence framework for social work in Singapore. This is my third suggestion. Conceptualizing a cultural competence framework relevant to Singapore. I think it is important to engage the different stakeholders of different fields and sectors using a transdisciplinary approach. Let me just very briefly talk about what is transdisciplinarity. It should be top down from the government, top down from professionals, but it must also be bottom up, in that workers from the ground, our clients from the ground, they would be able to contribute as equal partners to so-called the top-down sector. It should also be across disciplines, across sectors, across cultures, and even across borders with our colleagues from the region. I've learned so much from my colleagues from Indonesia and Malaysia and Brunei about how they have developed, for example, counseling modalities based on their religious beliefs, principles, and it has worked so well for the Muslim communities in these countries. So there is this very interesting Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration that has worked out a model. There are three dimensions to it. The first dimension is racially and culturally specific attributes. The second dimension is core elements, competence of cultural competence. The third dimension is the focus of culturally responsive services. And then there are juxtaposed, and there is actually a cube. I'm not going to elaborate that, but using such a model in improving cultural competence in an organization, I would like to suggest in the case of Singapore, we can even work out in dimension one racially and culturally specific attributes. We should consider elaborating the specific cultural competencies for working with Chinese children, Malay couples, Indian families with an adolescent, older adults, and so on. And this could add to this model that is already used. There is another dimension on core elements and competencies of cultural competence. In the case of Singapore, we can add a sub-dimension using social work process model to do with engagement, assessment, intervention, and evaluation, of course, with a contract. The third dimension is really to look at the culturally responsive services. And in the case of Singapore, we can actually work out services for marital and family therapy, critical incidents, death and dying. Two possible types of research can go on to develop culturally responsive services. I would like to take a break and get my colleague to show you a video based on the work I have done in culturally in a setting, Wenchuan, which is a town of 12,000 people. Half of it are Qiang and Zhang minority. I'll show you a little bit in about 3 over minutes, the work that we have developed based on cultural sensitivity. Thank you.
Disasters are inevitable, be it floods, be it earthquakes, and even human-made disasters. I believe that after a disaster, there is this hope where we can build back better. I'm Timothy Sim, born and bred Singaporean, and I've been involved in disaster management since 2008. I'm in this kind of research because of the earthquake that happened in 2008 in Sichuan province, where about 90,000 people perished and went missing. It was one of the biggest earthquakes we've had in China for the past decades. We've spent about 7 years now working in Sichuan, and we have set up different kinds of work to do with psychosocial work, meaning working with children who have been disabled and teachers who have lost their wives and children, so people who have been very adversely affected by this earthquake. You see, before I went into the earthquake zone, I was preparing and consulting my colleagues from America, from the UK, from Australia. I was so prepared. And I went into the earthquake thinking I'm going to be dealing with PTSD. But when I went in, I realized that that's exactly not what I should be doing. There was a dictum in Sichuan at that time: run away from dogs, run away from fire, and run away from psychotherapists. A lot of volunteers or even professional psychologists who went to the Sichuan area trying to help actually did more harm. So then you have to think about other ways of working. There are very specific resources that we found out that we could use. It could be their local art, it could be their local dance. So these are the things that we capitalized on, where people can come together and work with one another using their own resources. So it is important that we become sensitive to what works for the people. We have put together the Sichuan model with 6 very important principles. The first is S, which means step by step. 摸着石头过河. In other words, we need to be very sensitive and very careful as we work in a post-disaster situation where things change. I stands for involvement. We need to involve and engage the local partners and stakeholders, particularly the people that we serve. 重在参与. C stands for being contextually respectful. H, helping people to help themselves and help one another. U, united effort. 齐心合力. AN stands for at no trouble, at no chaos, at no harm. 不添烦，不添乱，不造成二次伤害. I think we have learned a lot in working with them, how resilient they are, how capable they are in bouncing back. I think they have transformed my life definitely in the way I do psychotherapy now. I don't think I know as much. I think people are in charge of their own lives. And if we are able to work with them and help them to develop what they already have and capitalize on it, I think that's the way to go.
Okay. Can you see this? I hope if you're not able to see the screen, let me know. Okay. So in this video, it reminds me, I've been back in Singapore for about 3 years now, and I've come to know about, the use of certain Western models. For example, trauma-informed care, where we actually use it so widely that sometimes I'm a little concerned. I believe in trauma. I have worked in a place for 10 years where 12,000 people, only 3,000 left. Out of 12,000, only 3,000 left. All in the families died, children being amputated, and there was horrific trauma. But interestingly, the Chinese, the minorities over there in China were more than resilient, and they have taught me so many lessons. I put aside the PTSD frameworks that I brought with me, and to humbly know that, when we exert and impose some of these Western modalities, we would actually be doing them harm. As I was sharing with you in the video, that, some of our villagers very quickly, who did not know what is social work, who did not know what is counseling, knew that psychotherapists are there that would not be doing good work for them. And actually they shunned away. As a social worker myself, first of all, my identity is a social worker who is terribly well trained in counseling. Know that I have to go back to my social work roots and not that of a psychotherapist. So for 10 years in Sichuan, after the earthquake, we tried to respond and rebuild the community. I hardly used any of the theoretical frameworks I know in social work and counseling, and put aside all that I think was useful. What was most useful for me was definitely the systemic ideas of, looking at interactions and building relationships, and that's that, without trying to even implement any of the techniques that I'm so well trained in. It's a very humbling, but a definitely very enriching journey I have, working with the local people who don't even speak Mandarin and speak Sichuanese, and how on earth am I able to do any psychotherapy at all? So that was a lesson that I learned, and by capitalizing on their guozhuang traditional dance, on their embroidery, on their New Year art, Nianhua, we did so much with them in so therapeutic ways that we couldn't imagine. So these are some examples that I would like to share more with you in another sphere. In view of time, we have about another 11 minutes. I should be able to finish in 5 minutes so that we can have more exchange. My fourth suggestion for developing cultural competence in Singapore really is to promote boundary crossing learning and leadership. Now, what is boundary crossing learning? It is the competence that we learn and co-create with others outside our own scientific professional domain, institution, culture, and context, and if I may add, community. So SUSS, incidentally, at IAL, NIAL, had a boundary crossing learning and leadership master degree. This is a novel, transdisciplinary, focused, cutting edge and innovative program which was created to accelerate the capacities of training and adult education sector for professionals and leaders and those who function as organizational change makers to cope, strategize within and lead the highly disruptive world. There is a term called wicked problem. We are all living with wicked problems like racism, like natural disasters, and hence we need to work together. No one profession can claim their expertise and their ability to resolve some of these issues, such as the pandemic. We must work together. And if you ask me, and I've suggested to the head of program, Dr. Priscilla Pang, that perhaps cultural competence is an area of focus in their program. In 2019, I was invited by the Southeast CDC to a very interesting dialogue session where religious leaders, academics, as well as community leaders were present and talked about how the Chinese, the Malay, the Indians use or involve smoke in their religious rituals. And there was very heavy interaction, very active interaction that was immensely interesting. I think such an idea about crossing boundary to learn from one another is what that has already happened one way or another in our community. As I close, I think there is so much to do in Singapore in increasing cultural competence for social workers and counselors. Singapore can play a part in developing and promoting cultural competence in business, counseling, political science, health services, and definitely social work, because of the heritage that we have being a multiracial society. However, we must be reminded that cultural competence is a very complex business and that there is a tendency for systems and organizations, especially in the context of Singapore, to want to have a textbook solution, a quick fix, a recipe, or a how-to step-by-step approach. I would like to remind all of us that the complexity of achieving cultural competence does not allow for such easy solutions. So we need, and we can look to, for example, NUS, SSR, we can look to NCSS, we can look to, for example, the policy planning institutions, we can look to SASW to work together perhaps to be able to think of ways ahead. On my part, at the Master of Counselling level, we also emphasizes on diversity. This year, we have 2 workshops that are coming up, which we would like to invite you to join. This is a collaboration between SINDA and SUSS Master of Counselling on multicultural competence training workshops. Remember, I was suggesting that we should have we should be tailoring services that is multiculturally sensitive. This is one of the attempts that we are making. Ms. Chua Wei, who is an expert in palliative care, will be addressing grief dissonance in multicultural contexts. She will focus on the interplay between psychological and social influences. Dr. Lim Mik Yap from the United States, both of them our associates teaching in Master of Counselling. We are very privileged to have great teachers like themselves. Dr. Lim will be talking about using sculpting and letter writing to strengthening cultural responsiveness to address unspoken resistance in couple and family therapy. These are all very specific topics that are actually helping counselors and professionals to know how and how to do. I'm done with my presentation. I have taken about 40 minutes. These would be questions that we can discuss. If you don't already have questions, I will leave it to Dr. Chua Wei to decide. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Timothy Sim. Okay, so actually there are a lot of questions, and I think some questions are similar to what you have already asked. So if I would perhaps ask the first question, that's the most popular question. Are you ready?
No.
Okay, so are there tools for us to self-evaluate where are we on the cultural competence continuum? I think you have shared a slide on that, but I think this is the most popular question, so I thought.
Yeah, so yes, please refer to those tools that we have already given to you. The slides will be sent to you, so look out for those tools that I've managed to find. There may be more, but at least there are the lists that I have found for you.
Yep. So if you are a bit confused about what tools Dr. Sim is referring to, there's this PowerPoint that talks about the different index, the different scales. That will be the tools that you could use to self-assess. All right.
That
The next
would be,
question.
sorry, we've been slide 30.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So take note, it's slide 30. It will help you answer that question. Okay, the next second popular question is, let me see. Okay, I'll ask this one first. In view of the changing and growing LGBTQ plus landscape, what can we do to grow our cultural competencies and knowledge?
I think this is a diversity question, which is in some ways may or may not be related to cultural competence. I'm noting this and stating this to mention about the move towards diversity, including sexual diversity. So it is not exactly cultural diversity, but this is how the United States and even UK is moving along. One of our colleagues in our Malay community, Maimuna, she is doing a course on cultural competence with an American university, and I think you will get to know it soon. Coming back to sexuality, sexual diversity, I think this is a topic that is a very important one. And also, there are two things that I think would be similar to the cultural competence for us to be able to appreciate the community of of the diverse sexuality. I think we need to first of all have the knowledge, and number two, we must have experience interacting with these people, knowing their stories, understanding their lived experiences. And I think this is very important. This is one level. And repeating what I've mentioned in my presentation, at an agency level, even when we are looking at policies, we are looking at culture, particularly say if that is a Christian organization, how would they employ or not employ people with a different sexual orientation? I think these are issues that need to be addressed both at individual as well as organizational level. Very soon, our program, Master of Counseling, will be publicizing a workshop led by one of our lecturers, Master of Counseling lecturers who is now based in the UK, together with a group of experts in Singapore. Some are at policy level, some are researchers, some are practitioners. We will put together a small workshop. The available seats are very small. We are keeping it to only 35, and I'm keeping 10 for my own students and alumni. And so there will be only 15 places available. We will come together and think through what is lacking in Singapore. And we hope to be able to continue to discuss and to think about what are the actions needed in order for us to be sensitive, respectful in particularly counseling or social work, delivering counseling or social work for the community. The needs are unique. And I think that leads me to talk about one very important topic, which I think Dr. Chua Wei is also passionate about, and that is the person of the practitioner, person of the therapist. You must be aware of what you believe, what you don't, right? I happened to meet one of the veteran social workers whom I meet very regularly today, and she was just telling me she I'm not going to tell you her age, but she is much more senior than I. And she was saying that I don't understand, the same-sex marriages. And that's another era that she has come from. And I think this day and time, I'm not surprised that people younger than me belong to her era. So I think it is important that we become open, learn more, and immerse ourselves and get to know people who are in the minority, in the sexual minority community. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. The next popular question, it might be linked to organization. So there's an assumption that being Singaporeans growing up in a multicultural environment, we should be sensitive to individuals from diverse cultures. However, it is usually not the case. How would you suggest we employees can encourage our organizations to reevaluate our cultural competency?
Yeah. I have been thinking about which stage we are at of the cross-classical framework. I would consider, you can disagree with me, my own assessment of where our country is in terms of cultural competence is that of colorblind, the third stage. We think all Singaporeans are the same. I'm not sure if you know how to recite the pledge. We citizens, what? Oh my goodness. Wei Bin, can you start reciting the pledge?
We, the citizens of Singapore, pledge ourselves as one
united people, regardless of race, language, or religion, and pause there. We read this inside out from P1 all the way to JC, which is a fantastic pledge that we have that bring people together. But I think there is also not enough, I guess, awareness that we can be different, because there is such strive for us to be harmonious. There is such strive for us to be the same. And we know we are multicultural, but I think there is not enough space and room, which later on our forefather, our very respectable, the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, know that we need to bring in a lot more cultural appreciation. And I think that was the need of the context politically, how we were growing up as a nation. And I think some of these large macro contexts have not helped us to be more curious based on also historical events like racial riots that we have experienced. I think we must not put aside some of these very painful lessons for us to learn today, and how we need to continue to think about what we need to do to be united, and at the same time allowing ourselves to learn how to be able to appreciate different cultures. In FSCs, in any counseling settings, most of us are Chinese and who do not speak the Malay language, and who do not know, for example, the Indian cultures and religions. And I think this is really our problem as the mainstream counselors, to want to know more and to do more. And at the same time, capitalize on our own cultures. For example, I'm beginning to look at Confucianism. Some of the principles and some of the sayings are actually very, very helpful in the context of counseling Chinese. So I would look to our organizations in the social service sector, such as AMP, such as PPIS, such as CINDA, to actually come up with training packages or more courses like the one that we are doing together with CINDA, but to tailor to how Chinese can work with Malays and Muslims and Indian communities. I think these are all very important collaborations that should go on. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, Wei Bin.
Yeah, I actually have many thoughts, but also
Why
there are
don't you
so
share some too?
well, I think it's very interesting because you talk about cultural blindness. I'll try to make it short. Uh, because there's so many other questions that's interesting. I think there is a bit of this. I call it the legacy of nation building, right? So it didn't occur to me until I went overseas for about 2 months. Not like you went for many years. So I went for 2 months. I came back. Then I was watching that time it was called, I think, Youth Olympics or something like that. Happening in Singapore. So it struck me because in Singapore we can have an Indian girl wearing a Chinese costume doing a Malay dance, and we don't feel that is weird at all, right? So hence that whole idea of uh, prioritizing the Singaporean identity is something that I suppose the state has put a lot of emphasis on in terms of the social engineering, the living arrangement, and all that. So I think that might to some extent, I think, contribute to what Dr. Timothy Sim was talking about in terms of cultural blindness. But I think also our understanding of cultural diversity is also very limited by our nation building CMIO model. So I was doing a class one time, and two ladies, one identified herself as Malaysian Chinese, Hokkien, and the one identified herself as Singapore Chinese Cantonese. Um, but they both, one married a Chinese husband, the other one married an Indian husband. So their children will be of a different identified ethnic group. But when I trace back their origin, they are both so-called Baba. So, which I thought was very interesting because culture or race is also something that is prescribed by policymakers, and it's also something that we ascribe to ourselves. So I think it's I guess it's a lot more complex than how we tend to want to see it. So that was just some of the thoughts that I was having in my head as you were sharing. Yeah. Um, okay, so but let me jump to the next question, which this is maybe not the most popular, but I thought this is interesting. There's a tendency for organizations to depend on specialists. Malay Muslim workers automatically are the first choice for Malay Muslim clients. The queer clients might be referred to Ogachaka, even if their presenting problem or issue is not really directly related to their. I'm just reading from the question, the queerness, right? Is that okay? Um, yeah, any views about that?
Yeah, I do have a view. Our Malay clients, for example, who may be in the sexual minority community, may also prefer not to see a Malay counselor. Same with Chinese or a Christian or whatever that may be, to do with their sexual issues or their sexual orientation issues. So whilst I think having a Chinese to see a Chinese, a Malay to see a Malay, our clients may have other preferences too. So to me, it is always important to remember what the client needs. So at the very beginning, where you are doing the triaging, assessment, or matching of counselors, I think the people doing this matching should also be respectful to that. Our clients in the sexual minority community may choose to go beyond talking about the cultural issues and feel more comfortable to talk with other cultural or ethnic group counselor where they can explore. And I think if that's the case, the counselor who is from another ethnicity needs to also learn more about what the struggles, that's cultural struggles related to this client's culture, being Chinese, Malay, or Indian, and do not, push it aside because that's actually the struggle of the client. So I think that's, two sides of a coin. It can work. It can also not work in both ways of arranging. But the sensitivity at intake and assessment in view of the client's choices, I think that to me is paramount.
Okay, thank you. Next question. When assessing risk and harm in families in vulnerable situations, how can we ask questions to gather information in a culturally competent manner?
Risk and harm, I'm not exactly sure. That's when I think if you're talking about risk and harm in the area of family violence, when it
I
comes
suppose like
to
child protection.
child protection, child abuse, I
yeah.
think there is, we need to be very careful here. Like I was mentioning earlier, that once we look at cultural competence using a postmodern view about, everything is relative, everything is co-constructed, I would not be very comfortable to say that, in a certain culture, we beat children, right? We whack our children. I would not hide behind the wall of culture when it comes to suffering and risks. And I think you need to be very, very careful. And in the field of family violence, in child abuse and protection, the use of a cultural lens, I think, needs to be very, very carefully calibrated. So, yeah, that's what I would say. I'm putting it very point blank without, dolling it up. Risks are risks. Abuse is abuse. Biasness and racism, they are just that. I will not make it up.
Okay, thank you. I hear Dr. Sim's sharing cultural competency as humbling as well as holding loosely to some of our westernized models. May I ask, how can we then still be professional and be evidence-based in such an approach? Would it be too subjective?
Okay. What is evidence-based? Whose evidence is that? Is it Americans' evidence? Is it UK European evidence? Or is it our evidence in Singapore? I think that's the first thing. Unfortunately, even our Master of Counseling program, we are recolonizing ourselves and we are teaching Western models. We don't have a local book or a book that is developed locally. We are using all Western theories, and Singapore is very good at that. So we are recolonizing ourselves with all of these. This is a wonderful question that I think it's a big task for all the audience to start looking at building our own evidence that is contextually respectful and relevant. And we begin to decolonize ourselves using structural family therapy, which I believe and subscribe to. And we start doing that and make sure that, whatever Sal Minuchin is doing that is culturally inappropriate, we won't do it. CBT, using distorted thinking, using narrative, for example, some of these ideas that have philosophies that is not in sync with our Malay culture, Chinese culture, Indian culture, and other culture. I think we need to be very, very careful and build our own evidence. So that's point number one. How do we go about building our own evidence? I have alluded to practice research, which I think it's more grounds up. We can also use evidence-based practice where we do validation of Western model. I'm not against Western models, and I do not think we should throw away the baby and with the bath water. There are very good models that would be useful, but let us not just use them and impose them on our clients and our communities without critical evaluation, what works and what don't. So, and how do we then evaluate it? And precisely is what our colleague has just asked this question, using the diversity lens, using the cultural competence lens. For example, in CBT, when we use the cognitive distortion, to measure or to evaluate and assess some of our Muslim counterparts. We could actually say that, they are having black and white distorted thinking, or we have many other ideas. I'm very impressed by one of our students Malay students, Muslim students, during an exams. It was prayer time, and that was exams. I don't know why we have exams during prayer time, but he has to go out and he wanted to pray. And I was very impressed by this Malay student. He took about close to 10 minutes to go out to say his prayers and come back on. And I make a very quick comment. I say that's very unfair to the other students because you are getting your God to help you with these exams. But I'm just so full of admiration for this student that in the midst of his exams, he took away about 10 minutes to pray. And this kind of practices to me is just so amazing and so respectable that I think even our system is not giving it enough support, for example. So I think there are a lot of changes as we look at the different kinds of practices and the different kind of processes that we have in the counseling, service provision, and even education that we need to tweak and change. And beware of how our systems, our modalities, our imports from Western models are actually stifling some of the wonderful processes that could help people thrive and develop. So it's a long way to go. It's a very big job, but step by step, we can start doing it. And again, I want to go back to our counterparts in, SINDA, in PPIS, in AMP, and, all the other stakeholders to provide support resources for us to be able to learn from one another. Wei Bin?
Okay, thank you. What do you think is the biggest challenge or obstacle in achieving cultural competency within social work, Singapore social work industry today?
What is one of the biggest? I think is resources. Do we have the resources? For example, in Canada, you always have an interpreter present if there is a minority group for the social worker. Agencies do not provide that at the moment. A few of my colleagues, including Ms. Chua Wei, I hope she's listening to this, and Dr. Chua Wei and another friend of ours who is in the technology, we are looking into possibilities, for example, of developing immediate real-time translation app where I could, put it in my ear, and when the person is speaking Malay and I don't know Malay, I would be able to get 80-90% translated and be able to respond to the client in simple English, or I can provide the apparatus to translate into Malay when I speak English. What do we need? We need resources to be able to develop such kind of an app, to introduce interpretation into our services. And I think these would make us a lot more, effective. But it needs a lot of thinking outside the box. And I think Singapore Association of Social Workers could develop a cultural competence group to think of such solutions and get key stakeholders to support them in promoting cultural competence practices with different minorities. This is just an idea.
Okay, thank you. Let me try to look for the last question, which is that I think is interesting. Just in a minute. Got one quite provocative. Let me just maybe there's another question that's a bit safe, which I think is also
no. Go for the provocative one. Cannot.
Can. Okay, are you ready? Although there's not much votes for it, but I like provocative question.
Yes.
Can we really be structurally, culturally competent when LGBTQ plus clients are not a formal client group recognized by SCSW?
Can you repeat the question, the first part?
Okay, so I'm first of all, I'm not sure, I did not verify this is true, but this is the question. Can we really be structurally, culturally competent when LGBTQ plus clients are not a former client group recognized by SASW?
Okay, I'll leave that to SASW to provide a response, but at the same time, I think it will be amiss if we exclude the LGBT community and know little about it and do not provide service. And even worse is we do not know them and we provide a service that is irrelevant to their needs without appreciating and understanding what their experiences is. That's my take.
Yeah, I'll just respond to that because I'm not exactly sure. So I might be wrong. I'm not very much associated with SASW, but I'm not sure if that's true that they do not recognize the LGBTQ plus as a recognized social work population. So I'm not sure if that's the case. Um, but one thing I know actually is the ministries are actually quite beginning to focus on this as well, and they are definitely looking into developing more and more training in this area. Yeah.
Okay, can I also add on to this? Please do
Mm.
not look at LGBT, Q, the S2 group as clients. There are people in the LGBT community that are the brightest and they are the most capable. And I think if we do not consult these very bright people, it's to our loss.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe one last question. Let me see. What are some ways to develop methods that evaluate interventions, social work on the terms of the cultural groups you are working with? Example, how do you develop indigenously produced, co-produced evaluation methods?
Yeah. So there are many possibilities when we come to intervention research or in social work. We are beginning to pick up the term practice research. It could be quantitative and it could be qualitative, or it could be mixed methods. I think this is a very big question. There are so many possibilities, and I would like to interest you and introduce to you. There is an international community on practice research, and we are going to be hosting the next international conference on practice research. Please join us, and we already have a stream there for LGBTQ and cultural minority and cultural competence. So you can join us, and there are so many things that others have done that we can learn from one another. So practice research in a very global way to answer that big question is the way to go, where we critically reflect not just on outcome, but also process. When we say that, for example, how do we engage the minority group that we don't be a part of, or the mainstream when I'm not a part of that community? We can then look at the processes. So it's not just about outcome. When you say about evidence-based, often it is only focused on outcomes. We should go beyond just outcomes, especially in looking at cultural competence, to look at process research. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for all your questions, and Dr. Timothy Sim for your responses. I will now hand over the time to Asher from SSR. Thank you.
Thank you, both, for the very engaging presentation as well as discussion. I'll just like to share my screen first. Okay, so as I'm sharing my screen, please help us to improve our seminars by answering a very simple question that you see on your Zoom poll at this current moment. Okay, so while you're answering the question, I'll just say that on your screen now is the series of upcoming SSR events that will be happening from May all the way until August. To find out more about our events, please, you may join our mailing list by scanning the QR code that you see on your right. And thank you so much Prof. Sim and Dr. Chua for moderating today's session, for presenting and moderating today's session. We hope that all audiences have a engaging and fruitful learning from today's session, and we hope to see all of you soon. Have a good evening ahead and a good weekend. Thank you.